Everyone laughed when he chose the red clay bank to build his cabin. But when the temperature inside his fortress held 66 more degrees of heat and the wilderness outside couldn't touch him, the skeptics were left speechless. Samuel had turned the earth itself into his ally, a decision that would soon be revealed as nothing short of genius. Before we dive into this incredible tale of survival and innovation, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will reveal an even more unbelievable chapter. Samuel Bridger stood at the edge of the red clay bank, the weight of his decision hanging heavily in the still winter air. Most of the mountain men in the area had already built their cabins in more conventional locations near rivers or at the foot of the hills. But Samuel had chosen a spot that raised eyebrows and drew the mockery of his neighbors. The bank, steep and uneven, appeared to be a poor choice for anyone looking for safety, warmth, or shelter from the harsh winter winds. His cabin, too, would be unconventional. Instead of simply stacking logs and building the typical frontier shelter, Samuel had set his sights on something far different, carving his home directly into the earth itself. The red clay bank loomed behind him, its fiery hue stark against the surrounding snow-covered ground. It was not just a structure that Samuel aimed to create. It was a fortress, a cabin that could withstand everything. The wilderness threw its way from savage storms to the ever-present threat of wild animals. The idea had come to him one late evening while sitting around the fire, nursing his hands from the endless woodwork required to build a traditional log cabin. The mountain men often laughed about the indestructible cabins, joking that no matter how sturdy the walls, the roof always leaked and the floors always creaked. But Samuel, ever the quiet thinker, saw an opportunity in the clay itself. He had noticed how the earth held heat better than wood, how the ground seemed to regulate temperature in ways that nothing else could. The decision to build into the bank was bold, and it was not met with enthusiasm. His neighbors voiced their doubts and made their skepticism known. "You'll freeze in there," one had said, laughing at the very idea of trying to build into the clay. Another warned that the weight of the earth would crush the structure, as it was far too soft to support the pressure. But Samuel knew the truth. Nature itself held the key to survival. As winter crept closer, Samuel gathered his tools and prepared to begin. He knew the challenge ahead of him would be immense. But more than that, he knew that it was his only chance to truly survive the coming months. The traditional cabins, so easily penetrable by the harsh mountain winds and snow, were simply not enough. His gamble on the clay would either make him a pioneer or leave him with nothing. The first day of construction arrived, and Samuel stood before the clay bank with nothing but his axe, a few basic tools, and a vision. The first blow of the axe struck the earth, the sound deep and resonant. The red clay crumbled away in large chunks, revealing the compact earth beneath. He worked tirelessly, each day carving deeper into the hillside, shaping the earth into the walls that would become his refuge. The mountain men watched, shaking their heads, but they were too curious to stay away. Slowly, day by day, the cabin began to take form. Each log he placed, each piece of clay he added, was a step toward something no one had ever seen before, a cabin that was both part of the earth and shielded from it. As the days stretched on, the laughter of his neighbors became a constant backdrop to Samuel's work. He was accustomed to their mocking the mountain men were a tough breed, accustomed to seeing men fail in the face of the harsh wilderness. It was a place where survival was earned through grit and courage, not innovation. Yet, Samuel held firm in his resolve. His desire to build something that would truly withstand the wilderness, that would provide warmth and shelter beyond what traditional methods could offer, was stronger than any mockery. The first few days of construction were rough. The clay was softer than he had hoped, making it difficult to carve with the precision he wanted. But Samuel was no stranger to hard work, and he pressed on. He had learned from his father the value of steady, persistent effort, no matter how small the task. He worked through the cold, his hands raw from digging and shaping the clay. His mind, however, was focused on the task at hand. He could already feel the promise of what this cabin could become. Every so often, a curious neighbor would stop by, unable to resist the pull of the unusual project. Samuel noticed the skepticism in their eyes as they looked at his growing cabin. Some even went so far as to make jokes. "Is that the way to beat the cold, Bridger? Build a house out of dirt?" they would say. Samuel didn't respond. He simply kept working, knowing that the results would speak for themselves in time. One of the older men, a trapper named Elias, approached him one afternoon, his eyes squinting against the biting wind. He had seen a lot of men come and go in these mountains, each with their own ideas of how to make it through the winter. "You're a fool, Bridger," Elias said gruffly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in the wilderness. "That clay won't save you. It'll freeze in there, and you'll be dead before spring." But Samuel didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that words from others often came from fear, not wisdom, fear of the unknown, fear of change. Samuel's project was nothing less than an attempt to change the way men thought about survival in the mountains. His cabin, built into the earth itself, would either become a beacon of progress or a grim reminder of failure. But that was a risk he was willing to take. By the end of the week, the structure had taken shape. The cabin wasn't much to look at, but it was solid. The entrance was framed with logs, and the roofline began to take shape above. The inside was still a mess of rough walls and exposed clay, but the skeleton of the cabin was there. Each log he placed, each handful of clay he molded, brought him closer to a place of refuge. Despite the mocking, Samuel knew one thing for sure. The work was hard, but the results would be worth it. And as the temperature began to dip, he felt an odd sense of peace. It was only a matter of time before the wilderness outside would test his creation, and only then would he know if it could truly stand up to the mountain's unforgiving winters. The days grew colder as Samuel Bridger dug deeper into the red clay bank, each stroke of his axe more deliberate than the last. His hands ached, but the pain was nothing compared to the thrill of watching his cabin slowly come to life. The foundation, far sturdier than any he had hoped for, took shape beneath him, and he could feel the earth pushing back, not in resistance, but in quiet approval. He had made the right choice. The clay, soft and yielding at first, had become a dense, solid base as he carved away the surface. The deeper he went, the more he realized the significance of his decision. The clay, while still malleable, was remarkably stable. Where others had predicted failure, Samuel found resilience. The temperature inside his growing cabin remained steady, almost warmer than expected, even as the winds outside howled in their icy fury. The earth, he now knew, was an ally. It wasn't just about building a home. It was about creating something capable of standing the test of time. The mountain men who had previously laughed at Samuel's ambition began to drift closer, drawn by curiosity. They watched as he worked, their expressions shifting from doubt to confusion. What was this man doing? It wasn't the kind of work they were used to seeing. Samuel wasn't just stacking logs, he was shaping the very ground beneath him. He worked with a meticulousness that could have only come from an obsession. Each log he placed, each piece of clay he molded, became another step in his quiet rebellion against tradition. The first night Samuel spent inside the partial cabin marked a significant shift. The wind howled outside, but inside, the temperature remained steady. The cold that seeped into the traditional cabins through cracks and gaps was held at bay. Samuel had realized something profound. The earth itself provided insulation that no log cabin could ever match. The warmth within the walls of his cabin felt like a secret, a promise of shelter that he hadn't even anticipated. For the first time, Samuel could allow himself a moment of peace. The laughter of the men who had mocked him seemed distant now. He had his vision, and he was bringing it to life, one stone and one log at a time. With each passing day, the cabin grew, and the dream of a fortress against the wilderness took a more solid form. The foundation wasn't just the base of his cabin, it was the foundation of something much greater. Samuel knew that, should his creation hold strong, It would change the way the men in the mountains thought about shelter forever. That night, as the winds began to wail louder outside, Samuel lay on his cot, the warmth of the earth beneath him, providing a comfort he had never known. He smiled, but only faintly. The work wasn't finished. The real test was still to come. As winter's grip tightened on the mountain range, Samuel Bridger's cabin, built into the red clay bank, began to reveal its true power. The cabin, though still under construction, was no longer just a shelter. It had become a living testament to Samuel's vision, its walls humming with a quiet strength that spoke of resilience. The harsh cold outside continued to bite at the earth, but inside, the temperature remained steady, almost unnaturally warm for a cabin of its size. Samuel had known the clay would offer some insulation, but its effects were far more profound than he had anticipated. The walls absorbed heat from the faint sunlight that peeked through the overcast skies, holding onto it long after the sun had disappeared. The ground beneath his feet, which had once seemed an unreliable base, now felt like the solid ground of a fortress. The moisture in the air, so often an enemy of log cabins that allowed cold to seep through cracks, was kept in check by the clay's natural ability to regulate humidity and temperature. The elements were held at bay, and Samuel had done nothing more than carve into the earth and shape it with his hands. Yet, the benefits of building into the clay were not just practical. Samuel had begun to see the subtle beauty of the earth's silent power. As the days passed, the changing hues of the clay from soft browns to deeper reds seemed to mirror the passage of time itself. Each layer of the earth Samuel uncovered felt like it was giving something of itself to the creation he was building. It was a relationship, not just a construction. But the change wasn't just physical. As the temperature inside the cabin remained steady, Samuel found that his mind, too, felt calmer. The quiet warmth of the earth beneath him allowed him to think more clearly, and for the first time in a long time, he began to imagine the future. A future where his cabin might be a refuge not just for himself, but for anyone who found themselves lost in the wilderness. He had heard the stories of other mountain men who had built their cabins only to watch them slowly deteriorate, each passing year eating away at the structure as the weather took its toll. Samuel's cabin, however, seemed to be gaining strength with every passing day. The clay, naturally more stable than wood, resisted the typical dangers of rot, expansion, and contraction. There was a permanence to it that no log cabin, however sturdy, could ever boast. By the end of the 4th week, the cabin had begun to take on the shape Samuel had envisioned. The foundation was firm, and the walls, though rough and unfinished, were solid. The roofline had begun to take shape, and soon the first section of the cabin would be sealed. He had made remarkable progress, but he still had much to do. The real test was still ahead. Would his cabin hold up against the full fury of the mountain winter? That night, as Samuel sat beside the fire, looking out from his door, he noticed something that made his heart swell with quiet pride. The warmth inside his cabin, the heat that had come from the earth itself, seemed to push back against the cold outside. The world beyond his doorway was cold, hostile, and uninviting. But inside, Samuel was safe and for the first time, truly comfortable. Despite the growing warmth inside his cabin, Samuel Bridger could still hear the voices of doubt that echoed around him. The men in the surrounding camps had stopped laughing outright, but their whispers followed him as he worked. They didn't believe in what he was doing, though some had begun to watch with an almost reluctant curiosity. Samuel wasn't bothered by their skepticism. In fact, he had expected it. Innovation on the frontier was a dangerous thing. It threatened the stability of tradition, and tradition was all these men knew. The work was far from easy. Every day, Samuel spent long hours cutting, shaping, and securing the earth around him. The clay, once soft and pliable, had hardened in the colder temperatures, becoming more difficult to work with. But Samuel didn't shy away from the challenge. He had known that the path he chose would be filled with obstacles, but he had also understood that no new idea was born without resistance. Every cut of his axe, Every log he placed and every section of clay he smoothed into place was a step further from tradition and closer to his vision. The mornings were the hardest. The cold would creep in through the cracks in the earth, chilling him to the bone. Samuel would rise early, lighting his small fire to warm the cabin before he set to work. The warmth from the fire would fill the space, and though the clay walls seemed to radiate a stubborn cold, they held a silent promise, a promise of something better to come. As the morning light filtered through the small windows he had placed, Samuel would pause and look at the cabin. It was still unfinished, still rough around the edges, but it was his, and it was holding up. By midday, when the sun was at its peak, the cabin seemed to breathe. The heat from the earth swelled within, keeping the space warmer than the outside world could ever hope to be. Samuel worked in silence, his thoughts centered on the project. The other trappers, though still skeptical, began to ask more questions. They were seeing the potential in his unconventional methods, even if they couldn't fully admit it yet. Some approached him for advice on how to keep their own cabins warmer, asking how he had made the walls so sturdy. Samuel shared his techniques freely, not out of pride, but out of a desire to help. One day, a trapper named Ben, who had always mocked Samuel's plan, approached him directly. Ben was older, with a long beard that had gone mostly gray, and eyes that had seen too many harsh winters. "You're doing it wrong, Bridger," Ben said, his voice gravelly with skepticism. "Clay don't hold the cold or heat. It'll crack, and you'll be sorry. You can't change the way things are done." Samuel paused, considering the words. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But maybe the way things are done is the reason we're always fighting the cold, always fighting the weather." Ben shook his head and walked away, muttering under his breath. But Samuel remained unmoved. He had chosen this path, and there was no turning back now. The real test would come soon enough, and Samuel knew that his cabin, built with patience, grit, and innovation, would withstand whatever the mountains threw at it. As the sun dipped behind the distant peaks, the temperature outside began to drop once more. Samuel took a deep breath, stood tall, and looked at the nearly finished structure before him. He had spent weeks shaping this cabin, and it was more than just wood and earth. It was a promise, and in the cold, dark night, that promise felt as strong as the clay itself. Samuel had been preparing for this moment since the first day he began carving into the clay. The first real test of his creation was finally upon him. The weather had turned, and the sharp bite of the first true winter storm began to roll in from the mountains. The wind howled across the frozen land, the trees bending and creaking under the pressure of the gusts. Samuel knew the storm would be fierce, and he had prepared the cabin the best he could. The fire was already burning, and the doors were shut tight. He had no illusions about what would happen. The real challenge wasn't the storm itself, but the test it posed for his creation. As the temperature dropped outside, Samuel stoked the fire in the hearth and huddled near the warmth, his eyes scanning the cabin's walls. The heat from the fire, combined with the natural insulation of the earth, kept the interior of the cabin comfortable, a stark contrast to the brutal cold just beyond the door. The clay walls seemed to breathe with the temperature shifts, absorbing the heat from the fire during the day and slowly releasing it as the night grew colder. Samuel smiled to himself, but there was no time for complacency. The storm raged on, wind gusts slamming into the earth with an unforgiving ferocity. But inside the cabin, all was calm. The only sound was the occasional crackle of the fire and the wind moaning against the earth outside. Samuel sat, listening, wondering how the cabin would fare as the storm grew stronger. He had heard stories of mountain men who had lost everything to storms that came out of nowhere, their cabins ripped apart by gusts strong enough to break even the thickest of walls. But Samuel's walls, forged from the earth itself, held strong. As the night deepened, the storm continued its relentless assault on the land. Samuel checked the temperature inside the cabin. It was 66 degrees warmer than it was outside. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The cold that would have normally seeped into a cabin through the cracks in the walls, the floor, and the roof was held at bay. The cabin was warm, and for the first time, Samuel realized that his gamble on the red clay bank had paid off. The wind continued to howl, and the storm intensified, but Samuel knew, deep in his bones, that this cabin was built for something more than just surviving the elements. It was built to endure. And tonight, as the mountain's fury reached its peak, Samuel Bridger could feel the triumph of that quiet, persistent strength within the walls of his creation. In the midst of the storm, Samuel felt something stir inside him, not fear, but certainty. The journey had been long, but now, he knew, the world outside could not touch him. His cabin, built from earth and fire, was a sanctuary, and he had created it with nothing but his hands and his will. The cold, the storm, the wilderness, they were all distant threats now, far beyond the reach of what he had built. The storm that had swept across the mountain had passed, but its aftermath lingered in the crisp, biting air. Samuel Bridger stood at the threshold of his cabin, looking out across the rugged terrain, the silence after the storm almost deafening. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting a pale light over the snow-covered ground. Despite the beauty of the scene, Samuel knew that the real test of his cabin had only just begun. The storm had given him his first taste of what he had built, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed to see how his cabin could hold up over time, how it would handle the harshness of the wilderness that surrounded it. The first few days after the storm were calm, allowing Samuel to make small adjustments and repairs. He noticed something interesting. The temperature inside the cabin had remained steady, the heat from the earth and fire working in harmony. It was warmer than any cabin he'd built or seen in the area, and the walls seemed to be doing their job, holding the warmth in and keeping the cold out. He would often sit near the hearth and let the warmth seep into his bones, relishing the comfort his cabin provided. But Samuel was no fool. He knew that one calm spell of weather didn't mean much in the long run. The wilderness could turn on a dime, and he had to be ready. It wasn't long before the next test arrived, one more brutal than the last. A second, even fiercer storm swept in from the north, this time with a fury that left no doubt about its intent. The wind howled through the trees, snapping branches and sending snow swirling in every direction. This storm wasn't just about the cold, it was about the force of nature itself. Samuel knew that this would be the real challenge for his cabin. If it could withstand this, it could withstand anything. The first thing Samuel did was check the walls. He ran his hand along the clay, feeling the cool surface beneath his fingers. The cabin seemed solid, but he knew the true test wouldn't come until the storm began in earnest. He stoked the fire, ensuring it would burn brightly enough to maintain the cabin's temperature. The wind outside was already fierce, rattling the cabin's exterior. Samuel moved to the small window he had fashioned high in the wall. He could see the storm's fury gathering on the horizon, dark clouds rushing towards him. The wind began to pick up. First gently, then with increasing intensity, Samuel could feel the pressure building in the air as the storm approached. The fire inside the cabin crackled, a stark contrast to the noise outside. The cold began creeping in, but not as it had before. The clay walls, though still cool to the touch, held their own against the rush of wind. Samuel watched as the trees outside bent and twisted, as snow whipped in all directions, and yet inside, the cabin remained a steady refuge. He took a deep breath and pulled his thick woolen coat tighter around him. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The storm was upon him, and his creation, the cabin he had built with his own hands, using earth and fire, was facing its greatest trial. The wind slammed into the cabin with an intensity that rattled the logs and shook the earth beneath. Samuel could hear the howling outside, the shrill wail of the storm's fury, but it was muffled within the walls. The temperature inside, though not quite warm, was still bearable. The fire continued to burn, providing a steady warmth that cut through the chill. He could feel the difference. The clay walls, unlike traditional wood, were absorbing the heat from the fire and holding it in. The cold, though harsh outside, was no match for the quiet strength of the earth. The storm raged on through the night. Snow piled high against the door, and the wind beat relentlessly against the cabin's walls. But inside, Samuel sat beside the fire, watching the flames dance. He had made the right choice. His cabin, despite the storm's fury, held firm. The clay, the earth, the carefully chosen logs, they all worked together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Samuel wasn't just surviving, he was thriving in the face of nature's most violent assault. As the night wore on and the storm began to subside, Samuel finally allowed himself to relax. His cabin had passed its first true test, and it had come through without faltering. For the first time in weeks he felt a sense of relief. His gamble on the red clay bank, his choice to build with innovation and care, had paid off. He had built something that could stand up to the wilderness itself. The next morning, Samuel woke to a calm he hadn't expected. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. The trees were stripped bare of their snow-laden branches, the sky was a pale blue, and the air had a sharp bite to it, but the winds had died down. Samuel stepped outside, feeling the crunch of snow beneath his boots, and gazed at the landscape around him. The world felt quiet, peaceful even, after the chaos of the storm. But Samuel didn't let the calm fool him. He knew that the wilderness was always just one step away from chaos. The storm had passed, but others would come. The real challenge for his cabin, and for him, was endurance. He needed to ensure that his creation wasn't just able to survive one storm, but many. And as he looked at the cabin he had built, partially hidden within the red clay bank, Samuel knew that the next test would be different. The storm had shown him that his cabin could withstand the immediate onslaught of nature, but could it stand the test of time? Samuel spent the next few days tending to the cabin, making minor adjustments where the storm had left its mark. The door, a thick slab of wood, reinforced with iron brackets, had held strong. The clay walls were slightly cracked in places, but nothing that wouldn't be easy to repair. The temperature inside remained steady, even as the air outside continued to drop. There was something magical about the way the clay held heat. It was as if the earth itself was protecting him from the relentless cold. But Samuel knew he couldn't rest yet. He had built something solid, something unique, but the real test was how it would fare over time. Could it continue to protect him when the storms returned? Could it stand the test of the long, harsh winters that were sure to come? Or would the relentless forces of nature eventually break through? As he stood at the edge of his cabin, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had built his cabin with nothing but his hands, his knowledge of the land, and his unshakable belief that the old ways could be improved upon. The mountain men had laughed at him, but now they were watching with quiet curiosity. Samuel wasn't just building a home, he was building a legacy that would, one way or another, endure. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Samuel stood in front of his cabin, taking in the quiet beauty of the land around him. The storms, the cold, the wilderness, they were all part of the landscape he had chosen to call home. And no matter what came next, Samuel knew he had done something that no one else had even dared to attempt. He had built something that would stand the test of time. The days passed in a quiet rhythm. Samuel Bridger continued his work on the cabin, refining the walls and making sure the clay held its shape despite the growing cold. The storms had been fierce, but the cabin had held steady. The wind had lost its bite, and the nights, though still cold, were manageable. Inside the cabin, the temperature was comfortable, a warmth that Samuel had come to appreciate in ways he hadn't anticipated when he first started his ambitious project. The mountain men who had laughed at him initially were starting to take notice, though they would never admit it aloud. Some of them would stop by for a casual visit, offering a few words of curiosity, but nothing that could be considered praise. They still held on to their skepticism, their traditions too tightly wrapped around them to let go. Yet the evidence of Samuel's success was undeniable. As the days grew shorter and the winter deepened, the walls of his cabin withstood the elements better than anything they had built. One man, Elias, had been the most vocal of his detractors. He would often stop by with a half-smirk on his face, pretending to check the progress of Samuel's work, but always lingering with a sharp eye, as if he could catch Samuel in some mistake that would prove him wrong. But Samuel knew better than to let Elias's doubts trouble him. He had seen this before, the way people clung to what they knew. Afraid of change. It was human nature, after all. But what intrigued Samuel was the way Elias started showing up more frequently, lingering a bit longer each time. It wasn't just curiosity. Samuel could see that Elias, like so many others, was beginning to wonder if he might have been wrong. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon and the first signs of snow began to drift from the mountains, Samuel was repairing a small crack in the clay wall when he heard footsteps crunching in the snow behind him. He turned to see Elias standing at the edge of the clearing, his breath misting in the cold air. "You still think this is going to hold?" Elias called out, though his voice was more neutral than it had been in the past. There was no mockery in his tone, no scorn. Samuel stood up slowly, wiping the clay from his hands. "I know it will," he said, meeting Elias's eyes with a quiet confidence. Elias stood there for a moment, studying the cabin. The cold air whipped around them, but inside the walls, warmth lingered. It was the same feeling that Samuel had experienced in the storm, the sensation that the cabin, with its solid clay walls and innovative construction, was not only protecting him from the elements, but also from the fears that had held others back. Elias didn't speak for a long while. He simply watched as Samuel finished the repairs on the crack and turned back to the fire that was burning brightly inside. The cabin's warmth seemed to seep into the air around them, and for the first time, Elias could see it, the subtle genius of Samuel's creation. "You've done something here," Elias finally said, his voice almost inaudible against the wind. "Something no one else would have dared." Samuel smiled faintly, but he didn't answer right away. He had no need to prove anything. The cabin spoke for itself. As Elias left, still muttering to himself, Samuel returned to his work. He knew that some of the men would still doubt, would still cling to the old ways. But as the days went on, the cabin began to speak louder than any words could. And Samuel didn't need anyone's approval. He had built something that would stand the test of time, something that would protect him and anyone else who chose to follow in his footsteps. Winter had come in full force now, and the storms came with relentless regularity. Samuel had been ready for this. He had built his cabin with the understanding that the seasons would test him. It wasn't just about surviving a single storm or a few harsh weeks. It was about enduring the long haul. The real strength of his creation was in its ability to withstand the everyday wear and tear of the wilderness, something that wasn't immediately obvious but would reveal itself in time. And reveal itself it did. The mountain men, once skeptical, now came to Samuel more often than he expected. Their visits had started out as casual, almost condescending, but now they had a different tone. They didn't come just to look or to ask questions. They came because they saw something in Samuel's work that intrigued them, something that went beyond survival and entered the realm of innovation. One of the men, John, had approached Samuel one chilly afternoon after a particularly heavy snowfall. John had been one of the most vocal critics at first, the one who had laughed the hardest when Samuel had first chosen the red clay bank. But now, he stood in front of the cabin with a new look in his eyes, one of genuine curiosity. "Mind if I take a look inside?" John asked, his voice less dismissive than before. Samuel nodded and stepped aside, gesturing for John to enter. The warmth hit John immediately, and he let out a low whistle. "I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath. The inside of the cabin was a stark contrast to the cold wilderness outside. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the air inside was calm, with not a trace of the howling wind that rattled the world beyond the door. John looked around, his eyes widening as he took in the solid yet humble construction. The walls were thick with clay, and the air was warm and dry. "How do you keep it so warm?" he asked, still in disbelief. "It's the earth," Samuel replied simply, his gaze fixed on the fire. The clay holds the heat better than any wood or stone. It keeps the warmth in, even when the storm rages outside. John nodded slowly, still processing the idea. He had spent years in the mountains, building the traditional way, but now he could see it for himself. "You've done something that none of us have thought of before," he admitted, his voice tinged with respect. Samuel felt a quiet pride in his chest, but he didn't boast. He wasn't building this cabin for the praise. He had built it for himself, and if others could learn from it, then that was enough. As John left, he stopped at the door, turning back to Samuel. "You know, I might just try it myself next time. If I can find the right clay." Samuel smiled, a rare moment of satisfaction washing over him. The respect was growing. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't loud, but it was there. The mountain men were starting to see Samuel for what he was: not just a trapper, not just a man with a crazy idea, but an innovator. His creation was spreading, slowly but surely. And Samuel knew that this was just the beginning. The legacy of his cabin would endure, and in time it would become something that all of them would remember. Not as a fluke, but as a lesson in survival, ingenuity, and the quiet strength of the earth itself. As the winter deepened, Samuel Bridger found himself more and more in tune with the rhythms of the land and the clay he had carved into. Each day, as the temperature outside dipped further, the warmth inside his cabin remained constant, a quiet testament to the wisdom of his decision to build into the earth. The cold winds that howled across the mountains had no purchase on the walls of his creation. The earth, which had once seemed like an obstacle, was now a steadfast protector, holding in the heat and keeping out the elements. But it wasn't just the physical warmth that Samuel had come to appreciate. The more he spent time in his cabin, the more he understood the deeper lessons that the earth itself was teaching him. Samuel was a man of few words, but the lessons from the clay were clear. Nature, when respected and understood, held the answers to many of the questions that had plagued men for generations. He had learned the importance of patience. The cabin hadn't been built overnight, nor had its strength come from a single brilliant idea. It had been forged through countless hours of hard work, attention to detail, and an unwavering belief that there was a better way. Samuel knew now that the key to survival wasn't simply about brute force or toughening oneself against the elements. It was about working with the earth, using its natural qualities to one's advantage. Samuel had also learned the value of simplicity. The traditional cabins he had seen were often built with an eye toward appearance and speed. They were functional, but they were not built to last. Samuel's cabin was different. It was a lesson in how the simplest materials, when used thoughtfully, could create something far more resilient than any complicated structure. The clay, the logs, the iron reinforcements, these were not fancy materials, but they were the right ones. There was also a quiet power in the way the cabin sat in the landscape. It wasn't a monument to human ingenuity or ambition. It was a part of the land, shaped by the land, and at peace with the land. It blended into the natural world, yet it was strong enough to withstand the storms that had come and gone. Samuel had realized that his cabin was more than just shelter. It was a partnership with the earth, a respect for the forces that shaped the land and the elements that could either nurture or destroy. One afternoon, as Samuel stood outside, looking at the cabin nestled into the red clay bank, he realized how much he had changed. He had come to the mountains with the simple desire to survive. But now he understood that survival wasn't just about outlasting the dangers of the wilderness. It was about learning from it, adapting to it, and building something that could endure, just like the land itself. The lessons from the clay had shaped not only his cabin, but also his understanding of life in the wilderness. Samuel knew that the mountain men who had laughed at him would never truly understand what he had built. They saw a cabin, but he saw a legacy, a partnership with the earth that would stand long after the storms had passed and the winds had died down. In the quiet after the storms, Samuel Bridger began to feel a shift in the air. Word of his cabin had spread, not just among the trappers and settlers in the area, but further, into the deeper reaches of the frontier. Men had begun to visit, seeking not only shelter, but answers. They came not to mock, as they had done before, but with questions. How had he built it? What had made his cabin so warm? How had the clay held up so well under the pressure of the mountain's brutal winter? At first, Samuel had been reluctant to share his methods. He had worked tirelessly to perfect his design, and the last thing he wanted was for someone to steal his idea without understanding the depth of what had gone into it. But as the weeks wore on and more men arrived at his cabin, Samuel began to see that his creation was no longer just his own. It was becoming something greater, a symbol of possibility. One day, a trapper named William Marshall came to visit. Marshall had heard the rumors, had heard about the warmth that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, and he had to see it for himself. He was a seasoned man, one who had lived through many winters, and Samuel knew that Marshall wasn't easily impressed. When Marshall entered the cabin, he stood still for a moment, taking in the heat, the quiet strength of the walls, and the steady flicker of the fire. He looked at Samuel, his expression a mix of awe and disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned," Marshall muttered under his breath. "This is something." Samuel nodded, his face stoic as ever. "It works," he said simply. "The earth holds the warmth. The walls keep it in." Marshall's eyes flickered to the walls, the clay that now seemed so familiar to Samuel. "But how?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Why does the earth hold it like this?" Samuel took a deep breath, considering how to explain. "It's not magic," he said, shaking his head. "It's just understanding how the earth works. The clay absorbs heat from the fire, from the sun when it shines. It holds onto it. It's like a blanket wrapped around the cabin, keeping it warm even when the winds outside howl." Marshall was silent for a moment, running his hand along the rough surface of the wall. "I never would have thought of it," he admitted. "I've spent years trying to make do with what I've got. This is something different, something real." Samuel didn't respond. He didn't need to. He could see the respect in Marshall's eyes, and more than that, he could see the spark of understanding. The idea was spreading, slowly but surely. Samuel had built more than just a cabin. He had built a new way of thinking, a new way of surviving in the harsh world of the mountain wilderness. As Marshall left, he turned to Samuel one last time. "You've changed the game, Bridger," he said, his voice full of respect. "And I think others are going to follow your lead." Samuel nodded, his face unreadable. He wasn't in it for the fame, for the recognition. But he knew that what he had built was more than just a refuge from the elements. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when innovation met necessity and the strength of the earth was harnessed for survival. As the weeks dragged into months, winter in the mountains became even more severe. The sky often remained a pale, unbroken gray, with snow and ice clinging to the landscape, a constant reminder of nature's harshness. The storms came with less warning, fierce winds and heavy snow blanketing everything in their path. Yet, as Samuel stood inside his cabin, the storm raging just outside, he could feel a sense of pride swelling in his chest. His creation, his refuge, was holding up beautifully. The first real test of the cabin had been a trial by storm, but now, as the cold reached its peak, Samuel knew that his cabin was more than just a shelter. It had become a sanctuary from the storms, a place where he could withstand nature's cruelty. The clay walls, reinforced with the iron brackets and timber, kept the interior at a consistent, bearable temperature, even as the temperature outside dipped to frightening lows. One night, as the storm outside began to howl with its usual intensity, Samuel sat in front of the fire, a rare moment of stillness in the midst of his work. The wind rattled the cabin's door, and he could hear the snow accumulating on the roof. Still, the cabin felt warm, protected. Samuel couldn't help but feel the weight of the accomplishment settling over him. This cabin, built with his hands, with his mind, was a fortress in a world that offered no mercy. The fires crackled steadily, the warmth pressing against the cold that would otherwise have seeped into every corner. Outside, the storm surged to its peak. The howling wind sent gusts of snow up against the cabin walls, but the sturdy structure withstood every battering blow. Samuel checked the door, feeling the cold air pushing against it, but inside it remained a warm haven. The cold had no purchase here. The walls, the clay, the carefully designed roof, all held strong. He couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. Just a few months ago, he had been a man with a dream and a belief that there was a better way to survive the wilderness. Now, standing in the warmth of his cabin, the wind trying in vain to penetrate its walls, Samuel knew he had succeeded, not just for himself, but for anyone who would come after him. His cabin wasn't just a place to stay. It was a testament to what could be accomplished when you understood the land, when you respected its power and used its gifts. As the storm raged on, Samuel leaned back in his chair, eyes closed. The cabin had passed the test, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Nature would continue to test him, continue to throw challenges in his path, but he was no longer afraid. His cabin, his creation, was a shield, and he knew that it would protect him from whatever came next. Samuel Bridger had always been a quiet man, focused more on his work than on the world around him. But as winter wore on and the storms came with ever-increasing intensity, something began to change. It wasn't just the weather. It was the growing recognition that his cabin, his creation, was not just a shelter, it was a symbol. A symbol of innovation, of survival, and of quiet rebellion against tradition. More and more trappers came by, some in groups, others alone. They came to see the cabin that had withstood the fierce winter storms, the cabin built into the earth that had kept its inhabitants safe and warm when all around them the cold claimed the land. The men, once skeptical, now looked at Samuel with a new kind of respect, a kind that didn't require words but was spoken through the way they observed his work. They stood at the edge of his property, watching the walls, the doors, the roof, taking in the way the structure blended with the land, understanding in their own way that Samuel had done something they hadn't thought possible. Samuel never asked for praise, nor did he seek it. He had built the cabin for himself, for survival, and for the quiet satisfaction that came with knowing he had done something that worked. But even in the absence of words, he could feel the shift in the air. The respect was palpable. One morning, as Samuel worked on repairing a small crack in the wall, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was Elias, the man who had been most vocal in his doubts. Elias had come by frequently since the first storm, but today there was something different about the way he stood, the way he looked at the cabin. His face was no longer filled with ridicule but with curiosity and perhaps a hint of awe. "You've really done it, haven't you?" Elias said, his voice low but filled with respect. Samuel paused, wiping the clay from his hands. He didn't respond at first. What was there to say? He had built the cabin, and it had held up. That was enough. But Elias's tone, devoid of mockery, made Samuel pause. "I thought it would fail," Elias continued. "But it hasn't. It's still standing, and it's warm in there." Samuel nodded. "It's the earth," he replied simply. "The land gives us what we need. We just have to listen." Elias seemed to consider that for a moment before nodding slowly. "You're right," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. "I see it now. You've built something that lasts, something that doesn't just fight the elements, but works with them." Samuel didn't answer, but inside, a quiet satisfaction began to swell. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It wasn't about winning any arguments. It was about survival. It was about building something that could endure. And now, Elias and the others were starting to see that. As Elias left, Samuel stood at the door, watching him disappear into the snow. The men who had doubted him were beginning to understand, and Samuel knew that his cabin, the one built from the earth itself, would endure far longer than any of them could have imagined. It was a silent legacy, but a legacy nonetheless. The winds of change were slow, but they were coming. And Samuel's cabin would be there to stand witness to it all. The storm had passed, but the mountain's brutality was never far behind. For weeks, Samuel Bridger had kept to his cabin, strengthening his walls, adding layers to his roof, and reinforcing every corner of his creation. His isolation was peaceful, but it was a solitude that could not last forever. One afternoon, as the winds picked up again and snow began to fall heavily, a new visitor arrived. It was William Marshall, the trapper whose cabin had been torn apart by a grizzly bear during the previous spring. Marshall's face was drawn, his eyes weary. He had come seeking answers. His cabin, built in the traditional manner, had failed him when he needed it most. "I need help, Bridger," Marshall said, his voice rough. "My cabin's gone. The bear broke through. Everything's ruined." Samuel took one look at Marshall's weathered face and knew the meaning of those words. It wasn't just the destruction of his home, it was the loss of safety, of security. Samuel nodded quietly, motioning for Marshall to follow him. "Let's get to work," Samuel said. Marshall watched in awe as Samuel led him through the steps of reinforcing his own cabin. Together, they worked, and Samuel showed him the strength of his method, the solid clay walls, the iron supports, the carefully crafted corners. When they were finished, Samuel handed Marshall the tools and nodded. "It'll hold," Samuel said, his voice steady. "You'll see." Marshall looked at the sturdy cabin, a quiet respect in his eyes. "You're right, Bridger. This is the way." The days grew shorter, and the final storm of the season approached with surprising speed. Samuel prepared the cabin, stoking the fire and ensuring everything was secure. The winds howled outside, but inside, the cabin held strong, as it always had. But this storm was different. The snowfall came in thick, heavy layers, and the temperature plunged to freezing levels. Samuel could hear the wind shrieking outside, testing the walls, but nothing penetrated. His cabin stood firm, solid against nature's relentless assault. The next morning, when the storm finally passed, Samuel stepped outside to inspect the damage. The world was buried beneath a blanket of snow, but his cabin remained untouched. Not a crack, not a shift. The clay walls, the reinforced corners, everything had held, just as he had planned. He stood for a moment, taking in the quiet. His creation had passed the final test. Samuel didn't need to say anything. The cabin, silent and steadfast, had spoken for itself. It was more than just shelter now. It was a testament to everything he had built, a legacy carved into the land. With a quiet nod to the wilderness, Samuel turned back to his cabin. The storm had come and gone, and his home had endured. As the seasons shifted, so did the tide of attention surrounding Samuel Bridger's cabin. What had begun as a whisper among the mountain men, an oddity built into the side of a red clay bank, gradually grew into something much bigger. Men from distant trapping camps began making their way to Samuel's cabin, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the stories they'd heard from those who had witnessed its warmth firsthand. Samuel didn't seek them out, didn't advertise his creation. He never offered a single word of explanation beyond the simplicity of his design. The clay, the wood, the iron, he had built it for himself, for survival, and that was all. But as word spread, the visitors came in increasing numbers, some with questions, some with awe, and some with a quiet respect for the man who had dared to build differently. Among them was a young trapper named Jonas, who had been living through one of the harshest winters of his life. His cabin, hastily constructed and barely adequate, had been destroyed by a combination of the wind and the bitter cold. When Jonas reached Samuel's cabin, he was tired, hungry, and desperate for any form of shelter that might withstand the coming storm. "Please," Jonas said as he stood at the doorway, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I've heard what your cabin can do. Can I stay here until the storm passes?" Samuel stepped aside without hesitation, offering Jonas the warmth of the fire that crackled inside. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Samuel said quietly. "It'll keep you warm." Jonas entered, his eyes wide as he felt the heat immediately envelop him. The cabin, built of earth, timber, and iron, was the opposite of the cold and barren wilderness he had known. It was a place of comfort, of sanctuary. As he sat by the fire, he couldn't help but marvel at the way the warmth seemed to flow through the very walls. For the first time in weeks, he felt safe. "I don't know how you did it," Jonas said, shaking his head in disbelief. "This cabin is more than a home, it's a fortress." Samuel simply nodded, his thoughts already drifting toward the next project, the next challenge. He didn't need to explain how or why he had built it. The respect in Jonas's eyes was enough. As the storm raged outside, the men sat in silence, the fire crackling in the hearth, a quiet affirmation that Samuel's creation had already begun to change lives. Word of his cabin was spreading far beyond the immediate region, carried by those who had experienced its shelter firsthand. Samuel had built not just a home, but a legacy. Years had passed since Samuel Bridger had first begun to carve his cabin into the red clay bank. What was once a solitary act of survival had grown into something far more significant. His creation, now known as the Bridger-style cabin, had become the new standard for those who sought shelter in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness of the Rocky Mountains. By the time spring arrived in 1843, the fur trade was beginning to fade. The beaver population had dwindled, and new technologies were making trapping less profitable. Many of the trappers who had once called the mountains home began to leave for new frontiers, seeking opportunities elsewhere. But Samuel's cabins, his fortress-like designs, remained, scattered throughout the mountains, standing as silent monuments to his innovation. Settlers, prospectors, and homesteaders who passed through the area began to take notice. They would often stop and inspect the cabins, intrigued by their sturdiness and the ingenuity that had gone into their construction. It wasn't long before the Bridger-style cabin became a sought-after model for anyone building on the frontier. Samuel, for his part, had long since moved away from the mountains, settling on a small ranch in the Oregon Territory. He had married, started a family, and left the wilderness behind. But the legacy of his work was still alive in the cabins that dotted the landscape. What had once been a quiet innovation born of necessity had now become a symbol of practical, sustainable construction. One summer day in 1850, Samuel made a trip back to the mountains, a place he had not seen in years. He rode into a small valley, where he had once spent so much of his time, and was astonished to find that the cabin he had built all those years ago was still standing strong. The walls had weathered, the clay had darkened, but the structure had endured. A family of settlers now occupied the cabin, having moved in just the previous winter. They greeted Samuel warmly, offering him a seat by their hearth. The fire burned bright, and the warmth from the clay walls wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. The family, unaware of Samuel's identity, spoke of the cabin's history, how it had been built by a man who had understood the land and its ways, a man whose legacy had lived on in the very walls of their home. As Samuel sat back in the chair, the weight of his quiet achievement settled in. His cabin, built out of necessity, had become a refuge for those who had come after him. It had stood the test of time, outlasting the storms, the harsh winters, and the changes of the world around it. For Samuel, this was enough. He didn't need fame or recognition. His work had done the talking for him. The cabins he had built, sturdy, resilient, and simple, would stand for generations. The legacy of his innovation would remain long after he was gone, carved into the very land that had shaped him. And with that, Samuel Bridger, the quiet innovator of the frontier, knew that his place in history had been secured, not through glory or recognition, but through the enduring strength of his work.